Assistant Professor in the Department of Business Administration, Future Institute of Engineering and Management. I'm honored to serve as your MC for today's session. Here's a quick question for you all. Have you ever wondered how we can integrate translational research with clinical practice to bring advanced imaging, genetics, and computational tools closer to patient care? Well, you are in the right place. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker of this session, Dr. Marvin G. Thomas, who is currently associated as Clinical Associate Professor in the Department of Ophthalmology, University of Leicester, where he leads the ultrascoped eye unit. He is also a consultant ophthalmologist at the University Hospital of Leicester NHS Trust. He has spent 12 years of research focusing on developmental retinal disorders, ocular imaging, and artificial intelligence. He completed his business and BSc and PhD both from the University of Leicester. In today's session, Dr. Thomas will enlighten us on the clinical perspective of deep learning in ophthalmology. Please join me in giving a cordial appreciative welcome to Dr. Thomas. Dr. Thomas, now the platform is all yours. You can start, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Sarkar, for the kind introduction and your words about my previous training as well as work we've been doing in Leicester. So I would like to also thank Dr. Rupa Bhattacharya, who invited me for this event, and hopefully you will find this useful. I will share my screen, and please let me know once this is visible to all of you. Great. So as you had introduced me, thank you for that invitation again. And my name is Marvin Thomas. I'm a clinical associate professor and a consultant ophthalmologist. And what that means is 50% of the time I'm doing clinical work within a hospital, within an eye department, looking at children with eye problems, children with genetic eye diseases, but also individuals with retinal problems. So these could be adults with retinal conditions such as age-related macular degeneration, diabetic retinopathy, and so on. And so today what I'll be doing is sharing a clinical perspective on how deep learning is reshaping ophthalmology, not just in screening programs, but increasingly across diagnostics, prognostics, and systemic health assessment as well. So in terms of disclosures, I have no commercial conflicts specific to this talk. I have previously undertook some consultation work for GSK and Leica Microsystems, but this is unrelated to the presentation today. And what I must emphasize also is that I'm a clinician with an interest in AI and not the other way around. So my background is actually clinical, and perhaps some of the more machine learning aspects that I'm presenting might be from other papers, but also from some of our collaborators whereby I collaborate with a number of machine learning scientists. In the latter parts of the talk, I will share some of our own data and results from our work. So it wouldn't be fair if I didn't tell a little bit about the city where I work and the place where I did some of my studying as well. And this is Leicester. It's within the East Midlands in the United Kingdom, and it's actually a city that punches above its weight. So we are famous for a number of things in Leicester, one of which more recently you'll see that there's a portrait there of a king. And so this is King Richard III, who was actually, his remains was identified beneath the car park. We also won the Champions League, if any of you are football fans, but that was a while back, and the odds of winning it at that particular time was 5,000 to 1. So we often punch above our weight. We also host and are the home of the world-class science and exploration, specifically the National Space Center. And what that means is that we also have access to very large computing clusters We have a very strong team of space researchers within the University of Leicester. And in fact, the Chancellor of the University of Leicester has very strong links with space science. Now, on the top right of your screen, these are famous people from the University of Leicester. This is Sir David Attenborough as well as Richard Attenborough. You might know them from TV programs, including, for instance, the Jurassic Park. So you wouldn't have Jurassic Park were it not for one of these Attenborough brothers. Finally, at the bottom right, this is one of the famous professors at the University of Leicester. This is Professor Sir Alec Jeffreys, and he works in the same department that I'm part of, which is the genetics department, also at the University of Leicester, where he discovered the concept of DNA fingerprinting, which is often used now on a day-to-day basis across the world. So moving on from Leicester, I thought I'll give you an overview of what I had planned for today. And so today's talk is divided into 4 parts. First, I'll outline how ophthalmology reached the forefront of medical AI. Then I'll focus on diabetic retinopathy. This is the clinical proving ground for deep learning. Next, we'll then move on to this concept called oculomics. I don't know if you've heard this before, and specifically how the eye serves as a non-invasive window into systemic health. And finally, I'll discuss pediatric ophthalmology, which is children with eye problems, where imaging and AI face unique challenges, but also have unique potential. So I'll try and cover all of this as part of today's talk, and hopefully I won't take the entire time period. It shouldn't be as long as the entire allocated session, because I certainly appreciate this is probably your Friday evening, or I guess it's night there in India, but it's mid-afternoon for us here in the UK. So in this first section, I want to highlight why ophthalmology has been uniquely primed to adopt AI technologies ahead of many other specialties. But here's the harsh reality. What we know about blindness is that 2.2 billion people worldwide has a vision impairment. But here's the tragedy of this, and that is actually at least 1 billion of those cases were preventable or treatable, which means that that's nearly half. We have the medical knowledge to prevent this blindness, but we lack the workforce and infrastructure to deliver the care globally. Now, to put these things into perspective, that's roughly 1 in 4 people on the earth with vision problems. Now, what are some of those key challenges related to visual impairment? And the challenges are actually quite staggering. 90% of the vision impairment cases are in low and middle income countries. So there's this huge geographic inequality. In many developing countries, there are only 1 ophthalmologist per 100,000. And this is particularly true for those developing countries. But in the UK, on the other hand, if we were to contextualize this, we have about 13 ophthalmologists per 100,000 people. So that's 13 times more. Meanwhile, our global population is also aging at an exponentially increasing the demand as well. And then traditional screening methods simply just cannot scale to meet this need. This is the global need we're talking about. And finally, most patients present really with advanced disease because they can't access early detection. So ultimately, earlier you're able to treat, the less morbidity that you then have from the disease burden. Now, what is the opportunity, therefore, as a result from artificial intelligence? It offers this path to potentially democratize access to specialist level screening, and it therefore could enable early detection at scale. And why do you think ophthalmology has been uniquely suited for AI? So why is that? There's 6 key reasons that when I was putting this talk together, I sort of was thinking about this. And first of all, we generate massive data sets naturally. So if you imagine every clinic, every visit has procedures linked with this, and these procedures include high resolution imaging. For example, now imaging is it almost feels like it's an extension of the normal examination. So any patient that comes into my medical retina clinic would end up having a scan of their eye. They would have a photograph of the back of their eye as well as a high resolution scan. So imagine the volume of data we are generating. Second is we have very clear clinical outcomes, right? Diabetic retinopathy, it either exists or it doesn't. So which means that this binary classification tasks are very well defined. The pathology is also very objective and anatomically visible on imaging, thus making ground truth labeling quite straightforward. Third, the disease burden is huge. So we already talked about the number of people globally that have visual impairment. We said 1 in 4 essentially. So imagine when it comes to diabetic retinopathy, there's more than 100 million people. I'll talk more about diabetic retinopathy a bit later, but there's millions of people with this condition, and there might be an equivalent number of imaging data sets available. Therefore, this creates this urgent need. There are other conditions that affect the eye, and this includes things like glaucoma, which is also another leading cause of blindness. Glaucoma is a condition where there is retinal nerve fiber layer damage, which often is due to high pressures in the eye. The fourth thing that is worthwhile thinking about is the retina can reveal systemic pathology. We can detect heart disease, stroke risk, even dementia from eye images. The fifth thing to consider here is our clinical workflows already depend on image interpretation. So AI really is a natural extension, and it's not really a big paradigm shift in that regard. It's just the next step, really. And finally, we have the most advanced regulatory framework. The FDA, for example, in the US, has already approved multiple AI devices for ophthalmology. So if you were to try and think of medical AI were in the Olympics, ophthalmology would essentially be winning gold in every event. I know you probably heard from dermatology, radiology, and so on, but honestly, I would say that ophthalmology would certainly be at the forefront. And this is also because the first FDA-approved autonomous AI diagnostic system in any medical field was actually for diabetic retinopathy, and that was back in 2018. And I'll touch on that further down the line. But let's not sugarcoat this, because creating these AI systems is incredibly expensive and time-consuming. Expert grading takes 3 to 5 minutes per image, and it can cost $5 to $10 US. For robust models, you need hundreds of thousands of images. And so straight away, just from annotation, we're talking about between $500,000 to $1 million, right? And even then, experts might disagree, like 13 to 15% of the time. For rare diseases, some conditions might have only fewer than 100 cases known globally, making the traditional supervised learning nearly impossible. The other thing to also bear in mind is the privacy concerns with regards to this. Retinal images can identify individuals potentially because they have some unique features, and sometimes consider them unique as fingerprints. And there have been previous papers published where it can predict whether or not a fundus image, a photo of the back of the eye is a male or a female, and also predict their age, for example, and so on. But there are emerging solutions to try and address some of these data requirements and challenges, and this includes things like active learning, which reduces annotation need by 30 to 50%, semi-supervised learning as well, synthetic data, which is becoming more common, as well as federated learning and foundation models, which you can pre-train on unlabeled data. So foundation models is something that I will also aim to cover in this talk in relation to ophthalmology. So what are those advantages of foundation models? So this brings us to a paradigm shift in medical AI foundation models. Think of these as the ChatGPT of medical imaging. And one particular foundation model, which I will talk about, is called RETFound. So RETFound was trained on 1.6 million unlabeled images. And this in turn can achieve almost 80% of full performance with just 10% of labeled training data. And then academic centers can then fine-tune these models with very limited resources. This in turn means that you can empower quite small teams, which previously only large tech companies was able to do. And this particular RETFound foundation model has really taken the whole the field of ophthalmology by storm now. And this was published in 2023 by Piers Keen's group based in UCL in Nature. Now, what could be some of the real world impact is that with a single foundation model, you can detect a number of different conditions like diabetic retinopathy, AMD, which is age-related macular degeneration, glaucoma, myopia. It's almost like equivalent to having a Swiss Army knife instead of having a whole toolbox, which is very disease specific. And the great thing about it is the RETFound model is actually publicly available on GitHub, so anyone can download and use it. Which now brings me to the second part, which is part 2, and this is focused on diabetic retinopathy, which is a success story. This is where AI in ophthalmology moved from research laboratories into real-world clinical practice, treating hundreds of thousands of patients. And just to give context to that, the global diabetic retinopathy crisis is actually staggering. The scale is absolutely staggering. So it's thought to be around 463 million adults with diabetes, and this was actually back in 2019, so it's probably a lot more now. And this is projected to reach 700 million by 2045. And of these, 28.5% of diabetics have some form of diabetic retinopathy. So that's more than 130 million people. And of that group, 4.4% have what's called as severe diabetic retinopathy. So 20 million are at risk of blindness. Yet 50% remain undiagnosed, particularly in developing countries. And less than 50% compliance, even in high-income countries. So there is a screening gap as well. And accordingly, the economic impact is profound, with over 500 billion annually from diabetic-related vision loss. So that many dollars is what's been projected. So every 30 seconds, you could think about it that every 30 seconds, someone loses their vision from diabetic retinopathy. And that's a tragedy because diabetic retinopathy is almost completely preventable with early detection. But there are some major barriers for effective screening. And these include geographic access issues. There could be severe shortage of trained graders, the cost of traditional screening, and the time it might take per patient as well. And finally, there could be poor follow-up compliance. Now, India itself has 77 million people with diabetes, the second highest in the world after China, actually. And so this is a particularly pressing problem across different nations in the world. Now, why is diabetic retinopathy the perfect AI target? And the reason is because there's several reasons, but these include we have a very clear, standardized grading system. And this is called the ETDRS, which is the Early Treatment Diabetic Retinopathy Study, which is what initially proved the classification. And the treatment decisions are often binary from a screening purposes. Either you refer in or you don't refer in. So based on this classification, you decide whether you want to refer this patient in for treatment and further screening or assessment, or you don't. Now, with diabetic retinopathy, for example, in the UK, we have very large data sets because every individual that has diabetes needs to have, as part of the screening program in the UK, they need to have every year or every 2 years some form of imaging at the back of the eye, which could be a fundus photo, which is the examples shown here, or it could be a scan called an optical coherence tomography scan. And the objective really is to find these visible features because the reason screening works in this condition is early detection really prevents blindness. And these objective findings include things like microaneurysms, where you can get, or hemorrhages, where you can see these red dots which are scattered across the retina here. Similarly, you can get exudates. So these are the smaller yellow dots that you see on the images. The deeper dark red dots are again more hemorrhages. But the most sort of devastating consequence is what we call as neovascularization, which is actually the new vessels forming. So you'll see the one on the bottom left of the screen. That's an example of neovascularization. These new vessels start forming. And the problem with new vessels is they unfortunately bleed, and then that can cause scarring and further problems like retinal detachments and traction on the retina. So the underlying problem in diabetes is there is low oxygen, and the retina's response to that is to try and create new blood vessels. Although it sounds like that's a good idea, unfortunately, these new vessels are far from ideal. And therefore, if we see patients with images like that in the bottom left, they need urgent treatment to try and rescue their vision. So how was AI implemented in diabetic retinopathy? Now, this is the study actually that changed everything. And actually, it was a team with Google's research team that led this very pivotal work. It's not just pivotal for ophthalmology, but it was across medical AI. They trained this deep learning algorithm using 127,000 images, which is obviously a massive undertaking at the time. And each image was graded by three or more ophthalmologists to create this gold standard labels. And the task was essentially to have this 5-class classification, which included no diabetic retinopathy, mild, moderate, severe, or proliferative. And so proliferative is where you have proliferation of blood vessels, like neovascularization, those images that I shared with you previously. And the clinical focus was to actually identify what's known as referable diabetic retinopathy. So if they had more than or equivalent to moderate disease, that would be considered referable diabetic retinopathy. And they used this Inception V3 architecture with transfer learning from ImageNet. Now, this was actually published in JAMA, which is one of the most prestigious journals, as some of you might be aware. And this actually became the most cited paper in ophthalmic AI. I think the last I checked, it had over 8,000 citations. Now, this had huge historical significance because this is the first major proof of concept that deep learning could work in ophthalmology screening at scale. And also this then opened up regulatory pathways specifically for FDA, the Food, Drug and Administration approval of similar systems. And then this inspired multiple number of, or thousands actually, I must say, of follow-up studies. But it also raised some very interesting questions. It raised important questions on equity, bias in medical AI, and also it asked questions regarding some of the limitations were acknowledged. Because the AI specificity actually was lower than expert ophthalmologist performance. And this moreover varied by ethnicity. So this is when the first time we started to think about bias concerns, because if someone was of a different ethnic background, this particular model would underperform. So just in terms of metrics, the sensitivity of this in this particular publication was 94.5%. That's the detection rate, and the specificity was 98.5%. So then we move on to, does this actually work in the real world? So that was obviously proof of concept. It was a research study led by Google. But now, how does this work in the real world? And the answer is yes. Actually, Thailand implemented an AI screening program nationally. This included 11 clinics, over 100,000 patients were screened, and it was integrated with universal healthcare. And 95% patient satisfaction was achieved, and this was faster than the traditional screening. Meanwhile, there was also this IDX-DR, which is achieved this historical milestone, which is the FDA approval in 2018. So this was the first autonomous AI diagnostic system. No physician oversight was required. It was designed for primary care, which means within the community, for instance, and it had immediate point of care results. And within the first year itself, over 23,000 patients were screened. And they did a cost-effective analysis, which showed that around $40 to $60 per quality adjusted life year. So what that means is it's one of the most cost-effective medical interventions that was available. And what is the impact from that? A 3 times increase in screening capacity and potentially 50% reduction in wait times. And the great thing about the IDX-DR, from an image, you can go from an image to a result within less than 60 seconds. Now, what are some of the lessons that we learned from diabetic retinopathy implementation? Critical success factors included strong validation in multi-center trials with diverse population and real-world conditions. Stakeholder buy-in from physician champions, administrative support, and IT engagement was particularly important. Integrated workflows with minimal disruption, clear protocols are also essential with automated documentation. And finally, comprehensive training. All staff had to be trained, ongoing education and troubleshooting support. But it also faced some major challenges. And these included about 20 to 30% of images were ungradable. And this is due to media opacity. For example, a lot of these aging populations, they also have cataracts, and therefore the quality of the images might be poor. There might be movement artifacts, there might be technical failures. And these are all major challenges that came out from some of these studies. Importantly, there was also some local population validations that were essential as part of this to further fine-tune based on different factors. Lastly, one of the comments that was discussed was actually human oversight still remain critical, because you often get these edge cases that require expert review, and clinical context is not available to that AI. And so patient communication needs human empathy. So yes, you might detect some of these things, but communication and physician-patient relationship and concordance to treatment requires a strong empathetic connection between the physician and the patient. So from the success story of diabetic retinopathy, so we talked about the initial research by Google, which then led on to national implementation, but also FDA approval. We're now moving on to perhaps one of the most exciting frontiers, and this is oculomics and systemic disease. This is where AI is used to analyze the eye to predict diseases throughout the entire body. This includes things like your heart, brain, kidneys, and more. And so this is where the eye truly becomes a window to your systemic health. Now, the retina is particularly unique, but beyond the retina, actually, even when we look at the external eye, so this is an image of an individual, and you can see in the corner of his eyelids, there are these yellowish elevated parts in his skin, what looks like tags, but actually these are cholesterol deposits. So this might be an individual that has high levels of cholesterol, and this is a condition called xanthelasma. Similarly, even without looking at the retina or taking a photo of the back of the eye, when we look externally at an individual's eye, sometimes we might notice yellowing of the sclera. The sclera is the white part of the eye. It should normally be white, but in this particular case, this individual has some yellowing. And this is because this individual, unfortunately, has jaundice, which is a liver disease because of excess bilirubin. And then the bottom screen actually shows where an individual has what looks like protruding eyes. And this is because they have a problem with their thyroid gland, and it's called a condition known as Graves' disease. And understandably, ophthalmologists have been often sometimes the first to spot systemic disease. And this is historically a noteworthy thing. So even before CT scans and ophthalmoscopy, the ways we could identify a systemic disease was some of these early manifestations in the eye. And this is just a last image just showing that, you know, the lower lid, when it's pulled down, normally it should be a little bit more redder, but actually this looks a bit pale, which can be a sign of anemia, which means low hemoglobin. So this particular, I provided a reference at the PubMed ID. This gives you a nice comprehensive overview of some of these links between the eye and systemic health. But then if we move away from the external eye and we look at actually structures inside the eye, so this is an image. So A1 shows what's called a fundus image. You might see this when you go to your optician. They take a picture of the back of the eye, or you might see this when you go to your eye doctor. And what you can straight away visualize very much non-invasively is the disc, which is the yellow part, the yellow round circle. This is the optic nerve. So this is the nerve fibers that take images to the back of your brain. And then you have these vasculature, which are the blood vessels. So these are the red long lines that you see within this particular image. There are now even more sophisticated techniques known as optical coherence tomography, which is again, completely non-invasive, very quick, high-resolution scans we can obtain at the back of the eye. And this can provide unprecedented detail of the retina, like the vasculature that you can see in images C1 and C2. And this is a technique called OCT angiography. So it's equivalent to taking an angiogram, but without the need to putting dye or doing an injection into the eye. And the axial scan through that particular region, the green line is then represented on the right, which is almost imagine like it's a slice through the retina. We can actually visualize individual retinal layers at a near cellular resolution. So for instance, we can get up to 3 to 6 micron resolution with some of our current OCT scans, which we use in the clinic. And as I say, these are routinely performed on almost every patient that comes to our clinic. So just bear in mind the potential volume of data that we have in ophthalmology. Now, if we go back in time and see how this has evolved, initially when we used to do an examination, we used to use what's known as an ophthalmoscope. And what you can see there is some of that early ophthalmoscope in 1851 when Helmholtz invented this. And then this evolved over time. In 1955, there was a fundus camera. So rather than just a person looking through this ophthalmoscope, people were trying to actually take pictures of this. And then it was really only in 2004 we started to do measurements of this vasculature. So measuring the vascular thickness, the vessel wall, and things like the tortuosity. And there was one particular software which is called IVAN, which is, and then subsequently in 2010, there was a second software called SIVA, which is actually, it stands for Singapore Eye Vessel Assessment. So these now enabled automated retinal vascular parameter measurements. Now we've moved on to using more deep learning approach, including there's recently been published a specific approach called automorph, which automatically extracts this vasculature. And we already talked about some of those FDA approved ones earlier. Now, what are we really looking for when we look at some of these images? This is an example of an individual who's got hypertension. Hypertension is high blood pressure. And there are a number of characteristic features you can see here, which is the vasculature can narrow, so the arteries might narrow. We might get some swelling at the back of the eye. There can be signs of ischemia, which might precipitate these exudates. There might be hemorrhages. And what we call as AV nicking, when these really hardened vessels go over these veins, they can actually cause a nick there as well. But something to bear in mind is that actually, and this is recent work that we published, and these are colleagues from my group as well as collaborators. So Ranjit Injeti, who is my PhD student, as well as Callum Hunt, who's also a PhD student, and Hejun Yoon, who's a postdoc. What we're showing here in this review was actually something to bear in mind is some of these biological differences. So these are retinal scans from 2 different individuals as well as fundus photos. So the image on the left, A, is an individual who's heavily pigmented. The image on the right, which is image B, is an individual that is lightly pigmented. So you could imagine accordingly, when we look at a scan through that foveal region, fovea is just a fancy Latin term for a pit, the shape is also different as a result. And so context matters. And that's why we led to this comprehensive review of cerebrovascular disease and how retinal phenotypes can predict cerebrovascular disease and why this is important within multi-ethnic populations. And the other 2 colleagues in that picture actually is Jatinder Minhas. He's a stroke specialist because we're doing some work in this space, and Rob Free, who's a data scientist. So, but oculomics really opens up a number of avenues of research. So this is what we call as oculomics, which is retinal imaging to predict and monitor, detect, predict, monitor systemic disease. And it's a new paradigm in medicine. And really the researchers and the group that coined this term is a group based in UCL, P.S. Keen, as well as Siegfried Wagner. And that's that first publication in 2020 where they coined this term of oculomics. And why the retina is so unique, as you just saw from some of the images earlier, we can visualize the vascular system, blood vessels non-invasively. We can also visualize neural tissue, which is the retina, which is an extension of the brain, completely non-invasive ways. And what AI does is actually detect some of these changes before those systemic symptoms even come about. And that's 3 to 5 years, potentially even before. And the AI is able to identify patterns humans can't perceive. And how does this transform ophthalmology? Because traditionally, if you were to think about our specialty, we really only diagnose and treat eye disease. But now an emerging role is that we might be the first line screening for systemic disease. And this might be cardiovascular risk assessment, neurological disease assessment, as well as metabolic disorder screening. So you can see how potentially some of these roles might change over time. Now, moving on to some of the specific studies that I wanted to share with you. Again, Google was one of the leaders in this area initially in 2018. Poplin and colleagues, they actually published this Google Health study, which showed some remarkable findings. From fundus photos alone, so just those photographs, no scans, the AI could predict, actually they could predict gender with a 97% accuracy. It could predict the age within 3 years, and it could predict the blood pressure within 11 millimeters of mercury, and it had a 71% accuracy of predicting smoking. Now, globally, what does this mean? Because remember, cardiovascular disease is a significant cause of mortality, but also morbidity. 18 million deaths per year from cardiovascular disease globally. And what the AI detects is all those features that we were talking about earlier, which include the AV nicking, arteriovenous crossing changes. You can detect things like the vessel caliber. You can detect tortuosity, whether there's increased vessel curvature, as well as some accuracy metrics that we just talked about. Now, the other big resource that's also available is the UK Biobank, and we often use this, as well as many other groups across the world, where there's more than 65,000 participants that have these fundus images, and using AI, we often use this to try and model different conditions to predict either major cardiovascular events up to 5 years before occurrence. And that's part of what some of these studies have done in the references that I've cited there. Now, moving away from cardiovascular disease to more neurological disease detection via retinal imaging is, the potential again here is enormous. 50 million people globally have dementia. Retinal nerve fiber layer thinning can occur 10 years before symptoms appear in dementia patients. And there's again a study which is led by UCL, which is called the ALZI study. This examined more than 300,000 patients from the UK Biobank, and as well as other sources as well within their data set. And they were able to predict dementia a lot earlier before symptoms arise. And this offers like a non-invasive alternative to things like a PET scan or MRI scan. And this has therefore potential for population screening. What you do with that information and so on is a different ethical question that can be debated, but it is something that is currently being heavily researched. From Parkinson's disease perspective, the thing to bear in mind is dopaminergic changes which are visible within the retina, and this can also correlate to disease severity. Now, in terms of cost comparison, obviously a fundus photo is a lot cheaper than an MRI scan, and I don't need to drill in that fact. Now this brings us to the foundation models, which is now really the cutting edge for retinal imaging. And we talked about this earlier, which is one of the landmark studies published in Nature. And this is called the RET-FOUND foundation model. And this used this 1.6 million unlabeled retinal images from multiple centers for pre-training using this masked autoencoder self-supervised learning. It had a certain amount of compute that was required, and it had 2 weeks of training. And the model is actually available freely on GitHub. If you type in RET-FOUND, you'll be able to find that if you want to do any fine-tuning and further downstream tasks from that. Now, it did ocular disease detection as expected, with just 10% of labeled data compared to supervised learning. So things like diabetic retinopathy, which we talked about, age-related macular degeneration, glaucoma, myopia, all these different conditions. But importantly, an important arm of the study was the systemic disease prediction, i.e. the oculomics. So the same foundation model could predict systemic disease from retinal images. For example, an AUC for ischemic stroke prediction was 0.753. Myocardial infarction was 0.7 and heart failure was 0.75 as well. So it did a great job. And from a practical point of view, one thing that was also highlighted is, you don't need the same amount of compute power if you were just doing some further fine tuning, and you could even start with just a small number of labeled images for fine tuning ret found. And they also gave some estimates of potential costs and comparators to perhaps using supervised learning from scratch. Now, the great thing about this study was actually the democratization and public release. So this model, as I said, is publicly available. Any researchers can use it, and it really does accelerate AI research globally. On the other hand, it did highlight some important limitations. Most of the training data was UK cohorts, performance variation across populations. This is an ongoing issue that you can see even from Google Health's previous work. They didn't do any multimodal fusion. They did separately color fundus photos, which is the 2D images, as well as the OCT, which is the 3D images, but they didn't fuse the data together. And they didn't really incorporate any demographics or visual acuity into their models. So those are some of those limitations. Now, the last part really I want to touch on is pediatric ophthalmology. This is the final section, and this is one of the most challenging sections really within ophthalmology. And the reason being the data scarcity, and I'll talk about that shortly. So what you might see at an optician is this table-mounted OCT machine, which on the left you can see an individual having the scan. But a child having the same scan is much more difficult. You might need to hold the baby up to the scanner or actually disassemble a complete scanner. So this is actually Anand Vinekar from India. He disassembled one of the OCT machines and he's trying to image this baby using the same type of device. And the diagnostic challenge really is, again, trying to image that foveal region, which I said is a Latin term for a pit, and children aren't the most cooperative. And they may also have conditions like this where their eyes move about involuntarily. And this is called nystagmus or infantile nystagmus because it often appears soon after birth, and it's often due to genetic conditions that affect the eye. And this is of particular interest to us. And we have pioneered one of these devices in Europe called a handheld OCT, whereby within a few seconds we can obtain the same high resolution images in a child. So rather than bringing the child to the OCT, we can bring the OCT or the imaging device to the child. Now, with any medical, with any sort of medical devices or systems, we love, if you talk to any medic, they love grading systems. Now, each city in UK is famous for something or the other. For example, Bristol in the UK is famous for the stool chart. Glasgow is famous for a coma scale. And lo and behold, actually, one of the claim to fames, other than Richard Attenborough and all the other things I mentioned, is actually a grading system based on the city of Leicester. And this is the Leicester grading system for arrested foveal development. And what this shows is different grades of foveal hypoplasia. So the image on the top panel shows what normal should look like. And if you imagine grade 4, which is basically no specialization feature. So these children are born with very poor vision and no features of a foveal pit or that or specialization of the outer retina. So what we had to do was obviously collaborate with a number of different centers, and this was one of my PhD students who undertook this work, as Helen, together with support from other colleagues within my group. And we gathered data together from a huge number of centers across the UK, but also across the world, really. And in the process, we also identified a number of different genes that then impact sight disorder. And this was a press release as a result of that. We then partnered with Leica Microsystems, who manufacture this handheld machine, so that we could then access this proprietary data to then build AI systems for analysis. And that was the whole idea behind this project. So in terms of a study design, it was a multi-center study. It was a retrospective cohort study, and we had a number of different locations. We also tapped into UK Biobank. Now, the issue here is one big problem in ophthalmology is we do have different OCT machines, and they have different scanning protocols. So you can see the variety of different data that one might come across as a result of this. These are some example images, example machines that we use. And the approach that we use, we collaborated with a group in India actually that helped us with putting together the model. And this was a unsupervised domain adaptation approach. And this is the clever part. It has three components: this feature extractor, a classifier network, and a discriminator network. So during training, we use both labeled source data where we know the diagnosis and unlabeled target data where we just have images. And the idea is that the domain loss trains the AI to become blind to which machine produced the image. And what we did in terms of an experimental paradigm is we used this domain adaptation experimental paradigm where we had label data, for example, from this table-mounted OCT1, and we had unlabeled data from this handheld OCT1, and then we used that to test on the actual unlabeled handheld OCT dataset to test for accuracy. And we created a number of different neural networks, so these domain adaptation neural networks, DAN1 all the way to DAN6. We also had a separate holdout set, and this we call the inference set. And this is for additional external validation and testing. So we use these different DAN sets from data that we acquired on a completely different machine from Oxford Nemos in the US, as well as Yonsei University in South Korea. And this is also a handheld machine, but it's a flex module. So this was quite a unique experimental paradigm, which we adapted and used. And what we found was, different performance indices, as you'd expect. Some of them performed really well, some perhaps not so well. And we noticed like one particular DAN4, for example, had quite a high false positive rate for saying that, oh, there's lots of cases of foveal hypoplasia. So this is actually, the source was handheld OCT1, and the target was a table-mounted OCT2. So that was a poor outcome for the DAN4 specific neural network. And when we look at this, what that means is this visualization basically tells an important story about this, about this test performance. On the left, you have DAN2, which is the table-mounted OCT1 to table-mounted OCT2, which shows relatively few errors, mostly correct classification. On the other hand, DAN4, which is the handheld OCT1 to table-mounted OCT2, this showed more misclassification. So the people icons, they represent different populations. So blue is basically, if it was correctly, people that are blue are the true negatives. The green is those that are the true positives. The red is the false negatives, and the orange is the false positives. And the bar chart basically just shows the proportions a little bit more clearer. So these ROC curves then just show the trade-off between sensitivity and specificity. The blue lines show like DAN1, for example, which had a very high AUC. And then this orange line basically, sorry, not orange, the other lines basically show for the other DAN models that we used. Now, when we compare these different ROC curves for domain adaptation between different devices, the best performing one we found was the HHOCT1. Most of them performed really well, to be honest. Like if you think about all four of them, the top four do quite well. It was really the ones that performed poorly was the DAN6, which is the table-mounted OCT2 to handheld OCT1, which is what we talked about earlier. So this is actually probably the most important slide, really, because this is now comparing our best performing model against some of the clinician performances. And we had clinicians from different ranges of experience, including clinicians with over 10 years expertise at labeling, not just labeling, classifying this condition, compared to, let's say, a clinician who's only had 1 year of experience. And what this drills home is the performance is as good or equivalent to that of a clinician that's been working for 10 years within this field. So now, just to put all of this together, where we're at is, here's the reality check, right? So we talked about adult diseases, we talked about systemic diseases, and we talked about pediatric diseases related to the eye. The reality is that 95% accuracy isn't necessarily enough for clinical adoption. Real world deployment requires sometimes much, much more. And more importantly, we need also interpretability. So clinicians often, including me, really want to know why the AI made a decision. We need seamless workflow integration without disrupting clinical efficiency. So if you imagine trying to plug in images into an AI system that's going to take 10 minutes in a clinical workflow is not really practical. There's also the need for regulatory approval. This includes like FDA clearance, CE marking, or local regulatory requirements. And there's also the need for trust. Clinicians really must trust the system to be able to use it appropriately. Final thing to mention is really about equity. Performance really must be consistent across populations. And so to address some of these things, especially the explainability related aspects, there might be some techniques that could be employed that includes attention maps, grad cams or saliency maps, feature visualization, and so on. What about the disparities that might which might be amplified as a result of medical AI? And this needs to be carefully managed. The Gulshan paper in particular, so that's the first paper I showed that's been cited a large number of times, again from Google. What that showed was that the performance varied by ethnicity. So if a model performs worse on some populations, the thing to bear in mind is deployment could actually worsen health inequities. And this is an important take-home message because the problem is clear. Algorithms that are trained on one population may not generalize well to other populations. And the solutions, what might be needed is really you need diverse training data from multiple populations, fairness metrics, monitoring performance parity, as well as transparent reporting on performance disparity. So specifically regarding reporting, there's a number of initiatives now ongoing regarding how you should report AI studies from this. And finally, community engagement is important when you have this model development as well. So just to conclude, let me summarize what we've learned, hopefully covered during this session. Why is ophthalmology leading AI in medicine? Because we have this very rich imaging data that just naturally accumulates as a result of clinical practice. It's not, you don't have to have extra effort to get this data. There is clear objective clinical outcomes that makes training straightforward, whether these are binary or classification based. There is this massive disease burden, meaning that there is this unmet urgent clinical need. There's also scope for exploration, including retina being a proxy for systemic health, and this term that we talked about, oculomics, which opens new possibilities. And already it's a trodden and proven path in ophthalmology. Regulatory pathways already exist and in different AI models that have already been implemented as a result of that. We also covered some of the current state-of-the-art foundation models, how this can now improve the platform to the next level. Even smaller academic departments can deploy some of this with just small data sets and a bit of fine-tuning, but it also generalizes across multiple diseases. And finally, we also talked about how public release of this and making these open source actually democratizes AI development globally. In terms of challenges, the diversity issue is a big one, and that's something that is at the forefront of a number of research groups. Interpretability and explainability, again, is important. And how, in practical terms, can you integrate this within a busy clinical scenario is also adoption challenges that should be considered. And with that, I just wanted to thank the organizers again for providing this opportunity. This is my group based in Leicester. And actually, this was a conference we recently held where we invited the inventor of OCT. So the chap in the middle is Professor David Huang, and the rest of the team is the group that I lead here in Leicester, including a few people that contributed as part of their PhDs to some of the work that I presented here. We also thank our funders and collaborators across different groups. Thank you very much for listening, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas. So now I open the platform for a question answer session. So anybody who is there to ask questions, you can put it on the chat box, or you can even raise your hands. So we have a question in the chat box.
Okay, so I think the question's on how do deep learning systems handle coexistent ocular conditions? For example, an AI system for diabetic retinopathy screening might miss other serious conditions like glaucoma, cataracts, if not specifically trained for them. That's an excellent question, actually, and you are absolutely right. If it's obviously trained for a particular use case scenario, it might not do very well at picking other conditions like glaucoma, and that's a valid point. Now, let's take a step back and think, okay, what would happen in a similar scenario whereby a clinician was to be doing the grading? Often the people that are trained to do grading, at least in the UK, they're not all clinical. There are some trained graders who have just had training to grade diabetic retinopathy. They don't necessarily have training to grade other conditions that affect the retina. And so as a result, what they can do is, if it goes against, as in it's away from the norm, so there is some pathology there that is not diabetic retinopathy related, they can flag it up and they can still refer that patient in. It's not a referable diabetic retinopathy, but it's a referable because there's a deviation from norm. So in a similar way, what some of the AI systems do is they can have a flag for just like even when it comes to quality, if it doesn't meet a certain gradable quality, a flag can be raised so that it can then be referred in, not for diabetic retinopathy per se, but rather for something else altogether. And I think that could be a potential way to get around this. There are also some additional AI tools that have been developed. There are some new platforms that are coming out whereby it's multi-disease. So we've seen one recently that we've been trialing, which can detect AMD, it can detect glaucoma, it can detect diabetic retinopathy, as well as some systemic disease. So it's almost like multi-disease classification. But needless to say, there's always going to be potential rare diseases which aren't accounted for. And so perhaps having a flag that it's deviated from normal is helpful, just in terms of referability. I hope that is helpful.
Thank you so much, sir. Sir, we have a question from Dr. Rupa Bhattacharya. Ma'am, you have raised hand. You have a question, ma'am?
Yeah. Good evening, sir. Sir, actually,
evening.
I'm asking for a person 55 years old, diabetic, highly myopic, have undergone 20 CNVM. She has to be injected 22 times to resist that. So what is the, I mean to ask that how is the possibility of her getting affected with glaucoma or recently she developed a hole in the central on the OCT angiogram. It is found that she developed a hole in the central part of the retina in the left eye. So what are the consequences, or can you just predict, or what is the result, or how is she going to get affected further?
Thank you for that question, Rupa. Obviously,
Yeah.
I can't completely comment on it without seeing the finer details and the scans and so on. But based on what you said, a summary would be essentially that this is an individual that has myopia. Myopia means they're short-sighted, and being myopic and short-sighted in itself has its risks. So often what that means is the eye is much larger and the retina is therefore stretched. They can develop what's known as myopic maculopathy. And I don't know if that's what you were referring to
Yes,
earlier.
sir. Yes, sir.
Right. So myopic maculopathy is whereby the macula, which is the fovea, which I was talking to you about earlier, this foveal region, which is that region of 6/6 or 20/20 vision, Latin term for a pit, it's affected. And that's because of, with myopic maculopathy, you can get choroidal neovascularization, which is a problem whereby new vessels might form, or it might be that because the retina is so thin and stretched, there might be other issues that affect the macula. Often in these scenarios, it requires input from a medical retina specialist, and in some instances also a vitreoretinal specialist. A vitreoretinal surgeon, for example, might be able to give advice on whether or not there are complications from the myopia, whether if it was a macular hole, then it's slightly different. That would be dealt by a vitreoretinal specialist rather than a medical retina specialist. And you also mentioned glaucoma. It's very difficult sometimes in myopic discs to assess glaucoma because they might have what's known as a tilted disc. But nevertheless, you can monitor the retinal nerve fiber layer and see whether or not there is thinning of that retinal nerve fiber layer over time. It doesn't require any sophisticated AI or anything, but this is just routine clinical monitoring from the scans and images and seeing over time whether that nerve fiber layer gets affected. I hope that's somewhat helpful. Obviously, I can't comment without finer details regarding the actual scans in the case.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Any more questions, please?
It must be quite late for you all there. I don't know what time are you at there?
It's at 7:20, approximately 7:20 p.m. So we are
Okay.
About that's what, a little late in the evening. Any more questions in the chat box is not there. And so let's wind up the session, sir. And I'll just quickly wind it up. On behalf of the organizing committee of Future Institute of Engineering and Management, and on my own behalf, it is a privilege to deliver the vote of thanks for today's session. First and foremost, I would like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Marvin Thomas, who has time today to join us. Dr. Thomas, you wonderfully started the session with an amicable gesture by giving us a glimpse of the city of Leicester, where you are currently residing. Then you delivered an enlightening talk on why ophthalmology is uniquely suited to AI. Your explanations of diabetic and pediatric retinopathy, how deep learning algorithm helps to detect diabetic retinopathy, oculomics and systematic disease, and where the eye is a window to systemic health. Last but not least, you also gave an insightful talk on the retina, which is the screen of our eyes, and various invasive methods of scanning the retinal images in humans. Through your words, we have come to know the new paradigm in medicine and how modern ophthalmology has moved beyond traditional examination and surgery towards precision, predictive, and technology-enabled eye care. In a nutshell, the session was thought-provoking and highly relevant to our faculty's developmental goals. I would also like to acknowledge our organizing team for their meticulous planning and seamless coordination. A warm thank you to all our participants, faculty members, staff, and guests for your active participation, attentive listening, and thoughtful questions you posed. Your engagement made today's session much more meaningful. Let us all join in this virtual platform in a round of applause for Dr. Thomas and all who contributed to this session. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much for your kind words. Thank you.
Bye-bye.